Okay, well here we are in week 4. Last week we talked about Hobbes and social contract, and we talked about power and government. And remember, we're trying to make this connection of things, right? As we work through all of our weeks, what should the government do? How should the government think and react? How much power should the government have? Now this week we're kind of sort of stay on that same theme. This week is chapters 9 and 10 in your text. Last week was Hobbes, and he introduces the social contract. But keep in mind from last week, right? For Hobbes, the sovereign should be all powerful, because once you agree to the social contract and you give the government, here are the things we want you to do, according to Hobbes, then you got to let the government do it. You've established the rules of the game, you agree to play by those rules, that's the way the rule's going to go, because he's trying to create a stable society, right? Again, remember, as I talked about last week, right? Hobbes has lived through civil war in England. So the idea is, he said, that's the worst thing that can happen, that destroys society. So in order to create a stable civil society, the government must have the power to be able to do that. And many of you offered in last week's discussion some very similar ideas along that line, okay? But what happens now is, after Hobbes, now we get Locke and Rousseau. Locke comes right after Hobbes, another Englishman, and then Rousseau comes almost 67 years later, around the time of the 18th century there, and he offers the French take on it. Hobbes and Locke are English, and then Rousseau is French. And what Rousseau is going to look at is, he has a great faith in mankind and humanity as to doing the right thing without the government getting involved. Where Locke is much more along the lines of with Hobbes, of understanding that self-interest gets in the way. Self-interest is problematic. But here's what his take on it. Okay? For Hobbes, once you kill the king in civil war, you get chaos, anarchy, that state of nature, constant state of war, man against man sort of thing. See, Locke comes back later if you know your English history or familiar with it, remember, there's chaos after the Civil War. After they killed Charles I, there's the great reign, not reign of terror, because that's Robespierre in France, but we get Cromwell, and the great protector of the realm, Lord Protector of the Realm, as he called himself. And it was a brutal, nasty time. It was an abuse of power. So what the English do is, Cromwell dies, and they go back and get the king again. They get Charles II, and they go back to the monarchy, right? So what Locke does when he comes around is he has to explain basically why it's okay to kill the king. Okay? Because Hobbes said you can't kill the king. When you kill the king, that's when society comes apart. Government has to have power. Government must be stable. Okay? So after the English Civil War, after the reign of Cromwell, we get back, and now we have Charles II's on the throne. So Locke has to come around and explain why this all makes sense. So Locke's vision of social contract, which I'll talk more about in the live lecture, is it's okay to change the government if the government doesn't do what the people want. Okay, so that's kind of the very big difference between Hobbes and Rousseau. Hobbes says you can never change and challenge government in his social contract, civil society. But where Locke is coming from is, yes, you can. You can change your government if the government's not doing what people want. Okay, and then Rousseau, the Frenchman, like I say, comes with his version of social contract much later, trying to explain the French Revolution. And the problems of the many French revolutions, but trying to explain the problem of the French Revolution, trying to get a civil society. And his argument on the social contract is, in a state of nature, man was perfectly free and happy. But what happened is, we start to form these governments, and it's really government that's the problem. So a social contract has to be created to limit the abuses of power in government by men who run the government. So you see, he takes a total 180 on that, where Hobbes and Locke think that men are inherently, kind of self-interested, and we need government to minimize that. Rousseau says, oh no, men are perfect and free and wonderful, but once they get involved in groups in civil society, then this government power will corrupt them. The power then corrupts men. So we have to create a social contract to limit this corrupting power of the government. Okay? So that's kind of the introduction. I say in the live lecture, I'll talk more about it. And in your chapters 9 and 10, the authors are very, very good about explaining this. Okay? So what then we have this week is we have our discussion. And this is a great discussion, one of my favorites. This talks about democracy and majority rule. And we start to look at the notion of what are some, going back to Plato, right? What are some of the flaws in democracy? What are some of the positives? Majority rule. If I have more votes in a democracy, I can make you do anything I want, and there's nothing the minority can do. That can be problematic, but yet that's democracy. So we start to look at democracy, right? As Americans, we think of ourselves as a democracy, and I think, as I mentioned previously, we're a constitutional republic, we're not a democracy. We have lots of checks on democracy because of the flaws within democracy. And again, I'll talk about more of those in the live lecture. But that's our discussion, right? Majority rule in democracy, the pros and cons. In our writing assignment then, we start to look at this concept of groupthink. When the majority goes along, will you just go along with the majority because you want to fit in? Or will you stand up to the majority if the majority is doing something wrong? Okay, and we offer a scenario there about a lab and some testing, and the one scientist with a great reputation everybody kind of goes along with, and then the other side, there's a scientist later who will challenge that. So the question becomes, kind of think of it like this as you're reflecting on it. What would you do, right? Everybody thinks this way, but you don't. Do you challenge them or do you just go along? That's the notion of groupthink that we're going to look at there. Okay? And then finally, our bibliography is due this week on our course project. Last week you gave me the outline. Here's what my paper is going to be about. This week you got to give me your sources. Which sources did you pick and why did you pick them? Okay? And then finally, the mid-quarter survey this week. Please take a few minutes and fill that out. Okay? So we're going to just kind of reiterate social contract this week, relook at power, look at democracy, and look at this notion of going along and the power of the majority to kind of get its own way. All right? If you have any questions, never hesitate to contact me, and I look forward to working with you this week. Bye now.